Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are and whenever you are. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 12 of The Devil and the Deep Blue Me. And I am your host, Rich Bruck. Today I would like to explore something that, for some odd reason, has been on my mind lately. Why stories outlive us. Why narrative might be the most human thing that we do, and what that means for how we think about legacy and meaning and the time that we have here on this big blue marble. We all want to be remembered, maybe not famous, maybe not immortalized in history books or in Wikipedia entries, but remembered by someone, somehow. We want to know that our time here mattered and that we left some sort of mark, that the world is just slightly different because we passed through it. And here's the truth that I've come to understand anyway. It's our stories that outlive us, not our achievements, not our possessions, not even most of our tangible creations, but the stories that people tell about us, the narratives that capture something essential about who we were and how we moved through the world. Just think about the people that you remember most vividly from your own life. Not just family and close friends, but anyone who left any sort of impression. What do you remember about them? Chances are it's stories, the funny things they said, the time they showed up for someone in exactly the right way, or the odd quirks that made them uniquely themselves. It's not their resume that gets retold at the dinner table, it's their stories. So today I want to explore why stories are so fundamental to human experience, how they outlast almost everything else that we create, and what that might mean for how we choose to live. We definitely all want to be remembered. I think about this more than I ever did when I was younger. Not in a morbid way, but in that natural way that happens as you get older, as more of your life is behind you than ahead of you. And as you start to think about what you're leaving behind. And what I've noticed is that the things we often think will define our legacy, our professional accomplishments, our accumulated possessions, our status of recognition, those things fade remarkably quickly. But stories just seem to persist. I've been teaching music for decades now, and I can tell you, students forget most of the technical information that I teach them. They forget the theory, they forget specific exercises. They even forget most of the songs that we worked on together, but they do remember the stories. They remember the time I told them about completely bombing a performance and what I learned from it. They remember the metaphor I used to explain rhythm. They remember the personal anecdote that made a concept click for them. And stories are how memory works. We don't remember information as abstract data. We remember it as a narrative form, as events that happen to us or others, as sequences of cause and effect, as experiences with emotional weight and human significance. Long after someone is gone, what we share are the stories. I mean, I never met my great-grandfather, but I could tell you all kinds of stories about him. The funny things that people say, the way they show up for other people, the odd quirks that make them uniquely themselves. This is what survives, not the summary of their life achievements, not their bank balance at death, and not even most of their physical creations, but the stories that captured something essential about their presence in the world. It's not their resume that gets retold at the dinner table. Think about the last family gathering you attended, the last time old friends got together and reminisced. What got talked about? Stories. Probably the same stories that you've heard before, but they get told again because that's how we keep people alive, how we pass on what mattered about them. And what I know now is that storytelling is not just entertainment, it's legacy. It's how we make sense of being alive, how we find meaning in the chaos of experience, how we understand ourselves and each other. It's how we pass on wisdom without lecturing, and how we hold on to the ones that we love after they're gone, and how we remind ourselves that being human is both fleeting and enduring. So maybe the best thing that we can do isn't to chase being extraordinary in some conventional sense. Maybe it's to live stories worth telling and to tell them generously while we can. So, why do stories have this power to outlast almost everything else? What is it about narrative that makes it so central to human experience and memory? Well, I think stories are how we make meaning from experience. Raw events don't inherently mean anything. They're just things that happened. But when you arrange events into a narrative, when you create a story with a beginning and a middle and an ending, with cause and effect, and with characters and conflicts and resolutions, suddenly those events, well, they mean something. I've had countless experiences of playing guitar, but the ones that become stories are the ones where something went horribly wrong or unexpectedly right, where there was tension and resolution, where I learned something or connected with someone, or even just failed spectacularly. These are the experiences I can tell as stories. And telling them as stories is what made them meaningful rather than just more time spent with an instrument. Stories engage emotion in ways that abstract information just doesn't. And emotional engagement is what creates lasting memory. You might forget a list of facts, but you'll remember a story that made you feel something, that made you laugh or made you cry, or even made you think differently about something that you thought you already understood. And this is why I've learned to teach through stories more than through technical explanation. When I want a student to understand something important about music or practice or performance, I tell them a story about when I learned that lesson, usually through some sort of embarrassing failure, and they remember the story, and the lesson comes along with it. Stories have this remarkable quality of being both specific and universal. A story about one person's particular experience can resonate with people who've never had that exact experience because the emotional truth transcends the specific details. Stories can create connection between people in ways that other forms of communication don't. When you share a story, you're inviting someone into your perspective and letting them see through your eyes, feel something of what you felt. And when someone really listens to your story, you feel seen and understood and far less alone. Stories teach without preaching. You can convey wisdom and values and lessons learned through stories in ways that don't trigger the resistance that direct instruction often does. People will accept insights from stories that they would reject if you just told them, what to think or what to do. And I've noticed this even on this podcast. When I share stories from my own experience, people engage with them. They find themselves in them. They take away lessons that are meaningful to them. But when I try to just tell people what I think they should do, the response is, it's much more resistant. Stories are remarkably durable. They can be passed down orally through generations, adapted to new context while maintaining their essential truth, transmitted across cultures and time periods. I mean, a good story survives because it captures something true about human experience that doesn't change even when the circumstances do. So, if stories are what outlive us, if that's how we're remembered and how we create meaning, what does that mean for how we should live? Well, personally, I think it means shifting focus from accumulating achievements to accumulating experiences worth turning into stories, from optimizing for success metrics to optimizing for memorable moments and genuine connections and interesting failures or surprising discoveries. Isn't that what makes a story worth telling? It's not perfection or constant triumph. Good stories have tension and conflict and uncertainty, failure, unexpected turns. They have vulnerability and honest human-scale challenges and responses. A life of uninterrupted success where everything goes according to plan, where you never struggle or fail or have to improvise, that might sound very appealing, but it doesn't make for interesting stories. And more importantly, it doesn't build character or wisdom or depth. My best stories, the ones people remember and ask me to tell again, are mostly about times I failed or struggled or had to figure something out under pressure. The time my guitar failed mid-performance and I had to borrow a guitar after trying to find one. Living stories worth telling requires presence. You have to actually be in your experiences, paying attention, noticing what's happening, and being available for the unexpected. If you're always on autopilot or half present while monitoring your phone, you're not creating the conditions for memorable experiences. And it also requires willingness to take risks, to try things that might not work, or to put yourself in situations where you're not entirely in control. Safe and predictable and controlled life might be very comfortable, but it doesn't generate stories that people want to hear. The best stories often involve other people, moments of connection, conflict, collaboration, misunderstanding, unexpected kindness. Living stories worth telling means engaging genuinely with other people and being open to relationships that might complicate your life, but they might also enrich it. And one of the things that I want to try doing more often, specifically because they'll make good stories, is accepting opportunities that seem a little too challenging, or travel to unfamiliar places without over-planning, or saying yes to invitations that feel risky, not recklessly, but deliberately courting the kind of experience that have narrative potential. But it's not enough to just live interesting stories. You also have to tell them, and tell them generously, which means being willing to be vulnerable, to share the parts where you didn't know what you were doing, and to let people see your uncertainty and your failure alongside those successes that you've been lucky enough to have. A lot of us hold back our best stories because we're embarrassed by them, because they reveal our imperfections or show times that we didn't have it all together. But those are exactly the stories that connect with people, that make you human rather than just impressive. And if you're thinking about legacy, about what you want people to remember about you after you're gone, the stories you tell now are what will be retold then. The values you demonstrate in your stories, the humor you share, the way you show up in narratives, that's what survives. But there's also another dimension to why stories outlive us. And I kind of want to explore that. Stories are how we maintain collective memory, how we preserve what matters across generations, how we stay connected to people and experiences that would otherwise have been lost to time. I mean, every family has stories that get told and retold and define something about family identity or history. My family has stories about my grandmother during World War II, about how my mom and dad met, and various other relatives doing things that, perfectly captured their character. And these stories get told at gatherings, shared with younger generations, adapted and embellished over time. And through this process, people who are gone, they stay present. It's their way of being in the world, their values, their humor, their quirks. All of that stays alive in the stories that we tell about them. I mean, I never met my great-grandfather. He died before I was born, but I know a lot about him through the stories that I've heard. Stories are also how cultures preserve their values, their history, their wisdom. Before writing, all cultural knowledge was maintained through oral stories. And even now, with all of our documentation technology, the stories we tell are what actually transmit culture from one generation to the next. And music itself is often a form of story. Songs tell stories, and our relationship with music is often story-shaped. The song you heard when you fell in love, the album that got you through a difficult time, or your very first concert. Stories are how we teach what really matters. Not facts and procedures, those can be looked up, but how to be human, how to handle difficulty, how to treat others, how to find meaning. That all gets taught through stories. When students ask me how to deal with performance anxiety, I don't give them a list of techniques. I tell them stories about my own anxiety, about performances that went terrible and ones that went very, very well, and about what I have learned through repeated exposure to that fear. The stories teach better, way better than instruction ever could. And if we think about what survives us, what makes us in some sense, immortal. It's the stories. Your possessions will be distributed or discarded. Your achievements will fade from memory. Even your creative work, unless you're famous for it, might be forgotten. But the stories people tell about you, those can persist for generations. And here's the thing. What gets remembered in stories isn't usually what you'd expect. It's not your biggest accomplishments or most impressive moments. It's often the small human things. The way you laughed, the kindness you showed to someone who needed it, the time you failed but handled it with grace, or the quirky habits that make you specifically you. And there's something very liberating about understanding this. You don't have to be extraordinary in some conventional sense. You just have to be authentically you. Pay attention to your experiences and be generous with your stories. Show up genuinely for other people. And that's enough to create a legacy that really, really matters. I remember a few years ago, I was invited to play at a memorial service for a guy that, I'd known casually. One of those people who shows up consistently in your life without really being a friend. He attended my shows regularly. He always sat in the same spot and always had a comment or a question afterward, but I really didn't know his story. Anyway, the memorial service was at his house, very informal, maybe 50 people. And what happened was spontaneous storytelling. People just started sharing stories about him, passing the microphone around and laughing and crying and filling in pieces of his life that most of us didn't even know. And through the stories, I learned that he'd been a civil rights activist in the 60s, that he'd taught himself to play piano in his 60s because he just simply wanted to, that he wrote letters to his grandchildren every single week, long handwritten letters full of advice and jokes and observations about the world, and that he'd once driven 8 hours to attend a friend's art opening because he just knew how much it would mean to them. But I think the story that got me was this. Apparently, he kept a notebook where he wrote down interesting things that people said. Not profound wisdom necessarily, just observations, jokes, turns of phrase that stuck with him as capturing something true or funny or beautiful. And when someone was going through a hard time, he would flip through his notebook and share things that might help or at least, make them smile. And that detail, that small practice of paying attention to people's words and saving them, it said more about who he was than any resume or obituary could have ever conveyed. It showed someone who valued human expression and who paid attention and who wanted to give back to people the gift of being heard and remembered. Anyway, when it was my turn to share, I talked about his, how he always came to my shows, but then I did something that I'd never done before. I played a song and dedicated it to the practice of paying attention, of noticing what matters, of preserving the human moments that might otherwise be lost. And afterward, several people came up to tell me their own stories about him, stories that hadn't been shared during the formal remembering. And I realized he's being kept alive through these stories, through the narrative of his life that we're collectively building and maintaining. And that day taught me something very crucial. Your legacy is the stories people tell about you, but it's also the stories you help them tell about themselves. This man had been a good listener, an encourager, someone who helped people find and value their own stories. And now they were returning the favor and keeping his story alive. And since then, I've tried to be a little more intentional about paying attention to people's stories, about asking questions that invite people to share experiences that matter to them, about helping people see the value in their own narratives, because that's how we create meaning together, through the stories we tell and the stories we help each other tell. And I'm trying to stop worrying as much about whether I'll be remembered and started focusing more on whether I'm creating stories worth telling, both from my own life and by helping others articulate theirs. Because that's the closest thing to immortality that any of us get, being part of an ongoing narrative, the story that keeps getting told because it captures something true about being human. And the through line in all is story, the story you're living, the story you're going to tell, the story that will outlive you. So make it a good one. Make it true. Make it generous. And make it yours. Anyway, now it's time for the enrichment segment. And we will explore some fascinating facts about stories and their power to survive across time. The oldest written story in the world is the Epic of Gilgamesh, dating back over 4,000 years to ancient Mesopotamia. It's a tale of friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, loss when Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh's subsequent search for meaning and immortality. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? 4,000 years later, we're still telling stories about friendship, loss, and the search for meaning. The technology has changed, the culture context is completely different, but the fundamental human questions and experiences that drive stories, they haven't changed a bit. And here's a fascinating finding. When you hear a story, your brain patterns start to synchronize with the storyteller's brain patterns. Neural coupling, they call it. Your brain literally starts to mirror the patterns of the person telling the story, creating a kind of neural resonance between teller and listener. And this might explain why stories feel so connecting, why they create intimacy in ways that other forms of communication don't. When someone tells you a story, you're not just receiving information, your brain is actually experiencing a version of what theirs experienced. And that's not abstract metaphor, that's measurable neuroscience. And here is something I find a little moving. Studies of memory show that when groups of people gather to remember someone who's died, they collectively create a more complete and accurate picture of that person than any individual could do alone. Each person has stories that the others don't know, and perspectives that fill in gaps, details that complete the narrative. And this suggests that the full story of anyone's life only exists in the collective memory of everyone who knew him. No single person, not even the person themselves, has the complete narrative. It's distributed across all the relationships, all the moments of connection, and all the stories that different people carry along. And as long as those stories keep being told, as long as people gather to remember and share, the person continues to exist in a very real way. Not as memory in a single mind, but as living narrative in the collective consciousness of community. So there, 4,000-year epics to modern neuroscience to the sociology of collective memory. Everything points to the same truth. Stories are not just how we entertain ourselves, they're how we create meaning, maintain connection, and preserve what matters, and achieve the only kind of immortality that's actually available to us at all. I know when I'm gone, my music might outlive me for a little while, or it might not. Most music doesn't survive its creator, but the stories in the songs, the experiences they capture, the emotional truths that they express, those have a better chance of persisting if they're honest and human and specific enough to be memorable. So I'm trying to write songs that are first and foremost good stories, songs that capture something true about experience in ways that might help someone else feel a little less alone or understand themselves a little better. And you can always find my music here on YouTube in the links in the channel description for Spotify and Apple Music and so forth. And even more than streaming numbers or playlist ads, what I hope for is that these songs become part of people's stories, that they show up in someone's memory associated with a moment that mattered to them. Because that's the real measure of whether a song succeeds. Not commercial success or critical recognition, but whether it becomes part of an ongoing story. Whether it helps people make sense of their own experiences. Whether it outlives the moment of its creation. Anyway, that, my friends, is episode 12, exploring why stories outlive us and what that means for how we live and what we leave behind. And I invite you to think about your own story. What are you living that will be worth telling? What experiences are you creating that might help someone else make sense of their own life? Or what values are you demonstrating through your actions that will survive in the stories people tell about you? Tell your stories, share them generously, be vulnerable enough to include the parts where you didn't know what you were doing, and help others tell their stories by listening deeply and asking good questions. Because in the end, this is how we live on, not through monuments or achievements, but through the stories that capture something true about who we were and how we moved through the world. Stories that might help someone else feel less alone, or understand themselves better, or even see new possibilities in their own experiences. So live the stories worth telling. Tell them while you can, and listen deeply to other stories, and trust that this is enough. This is how meaning gets made and preserved and passed along. And while you're out there living your next chapter, please have yourself a safe and happy week.